Welcome to the First Church in Chestnut Hills, May 10th, 2020 Sunday service. Welcome today, welcome always. We will begin with a pair of readings. The first is from Psalm 31. In you, O Lord, I seek refuge. Do not let me ever be put to shame. In your righteousness deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. You are indeed my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Take me out of the net that is hidden for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. My times are in your hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and persecutors. Let your face shine upon your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. The second reading is from the book of Genesis, chapter 9, verses 8 to 17. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all generations. I have set my bow in the heavens, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on earth. God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So ends the reading.
Before Jehovah's
The word covenant in the Bible describes an agreement between God and creation. The covenant with Abraham, for example, concerned his descendants and those who would worship God as God's people. And that covenant would get quite specific. The covenant mentioned in our reading, revealed by God to Noah, is far broader. It is between God and every living thing. The main undertaking of the covenant for God was that God would never again destroy the world by flood. And a sign of that covenant would be inscribed in the sky as a reminder to the world and as a reminder to God. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and earth. That bow, of course, is the rainbow. This passage describes how the rainbow came into being and what it signifies. That is in addition to being the result of sun refracted through water particles suspended in the atmosphere, often after a period of precipitation. That scientific description punctures some of the drama of the moment, I will duly admit. But the covenant between God and the world nonetheless stands as an account of the importance and value of life. Life in the thinking of the ancient Israelites, and as a result, the thinking of modern Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And that is all three. Noah is a very important figure across the Abrahamic traditions. In Islam, Noah is a significant prophet who was sent to preach repentance to the people, even though we know the mission didn't turn out terribly well. Because what prophets are sent to say does not always correlate with what the people will ultimately do. Unlike in Islam, Noah makes a short appearance in the Hebrew Scriptures. Build an ark, survive a flood, rebuild the world. Even with that shortened story, though no lesser status, the account of Noah's efforts are frequently told and retold. It is spoken of to children, it is depicted in storybooks. I've always wondered about that because the story, its implications are quite horrible. If we take it as a historical account, God wiped out the world, the vast majority of all life on the planet, because of the shortcomings of human beings. And yet it is also an outlandish scene with every animal being squeezed into a floating zoo, ready-made for humor and parody more than it is for any kind of moral reflection. If instead we consider the story of Noah as a parable, a lesson in the form of a story in the Bible, then we should take a step back from those details and consider the underlying message. What was the lead up to the flood, and what is the resulting covenant and the expectations of humans in it? Put another way, why did God flood the world? Well, the earth had become corrupt. It was filled with lawlessness and violence. People were ruining the world, everyone except Noah. He was the one moral man left in an immoral society. And so he was tasked with saving a portion of creation while the rest of the world was destroyed. The Bible is filled with examples of moral decay and then later efforts at restoration. So it should be no surprise if the stories at times coincide with the problems of the day. It's why the Bible has remained in many ways relevant over the centuries. And that enduring relevance sadly depends upon the tendency of human beings to fall away from the moral expectations of God. But it's also worth mentioning that God expects certain things from us. And unfortunately, other human beings have focused on different aspects of those expectations, leading to very different and divergent concerns. In case anyone was wondering, the story of Noah and the ark is just a story. It is presented to us as a compelling narrative of a good man faced with a wicked world. To suggest that the mechanics are accurate, that every breed of lion, tiger, and bear was gathered in docile pairs out alongside every gazelle, zebra, wildebeest, elephant, ostrich, and hippopotamus, is to skip blithely over the requirements of math, the confines of physics, or the consequences of genetics. And dare I mention, how exactly did Noah get a hold of polar bears, moose, and llamas, to name just a few of the unlikely passengers? Again, the point of the story is much more philosophical. What is a moral man to do when he is surrounded by an immoral society? Or as the Greeks would say, what should a virtuous person do? Virtue as the general characteristics of someone, their good life habits, rather than any specific response to a particular moral situation. Well, we don't have the details of what made Noah moral or virtuous, but we can deduce how he was different because of all the sins that he was leaving behind. Others' sins. God made a covenant with Noah, and those expectations are our best clues. The primary expectation within the covenant is that human beings may not harm or kill one another. And the penalty for inflicting such harm is to receive similar harm in return. This may be the biblical source for the concept of an eye for an eye, which is later explicitly mentioned and rejected in the Gospel of Matthew. Yes, rejected. It was rejected to be replaced with another call to turn the other cheek, meaning not to respond to violence with more violence. Like many things in the world, the idea of justice in this way has evolved. The balancing of harms is one rough theory of justice, one in which the response to any action is limited by the scope of the action. It's not an arm for an eye, it's not one's life for an insult. Imagine the lawless time of Noah, which inspired the Great Flood. God's further response was to make an agreement with all the world to avoid bloodshed, with the consequence of failure being receiving a similar dose of violence. Again, this is a way of limiting the response, no more than what was originally committed. An eye for an eye can be heard as a rallying cry for revenge, but in fact it was an effort to make the response proportional to the harm. The covenant with Noah was not made primarily to punish violence, but to hopefully reduce it. The goal was to minimize the need for violence rather than to assure that there would be a violent response. In the world of Noah, perhaps it was unrealistic to expect people to refrain from all forms of violence. Well, eventually, long afterwards, Jesus taught his disciples his lessons about, turning the other cheek. This happens during the era of the Roman Empire, which was by no means free from violence. But it was also a moment in history in which the rule of law was considered important. It was at least spoken about as being important. And so Jesus extends the lesson of Noah further, from proportionate violence to not lifting a hand in violence. That does not mean, by the way, that the person would not be punished in some manner. Justice was becoming a function of society. It was no longer a personal privilege. Previously in the ancient world, justice often took the form of self-help. The family of a victim would rise up to seize and kill the perpetrator of violence, and often everyone and anyone that got in the way. It was done without limit, so a limit needed to be created. Centuries later, during a time when the rule of law was far more prevalent, more familiar, Jesus took another step towards God's plan of a world without bloodshed. As ideas of justice evolve, this original limitation of violence to an eye for an eye, that may now seem archaic. But notice that in the book of Genesis, it didn't usher in a time where human beings no longer killed each other. The sons of Jacob would later wipe out an entire city because one of the princes dishonored their sister. The same tendency could be found in the time of Jesus, the time of Abraham Lincoln, the time of pretty much anyone after. And so rational notions of justice fall away when violence strikes close to home. Even in modern times, theories about justice are often intellectual playthings that we place aside when we are angered with the events around us. The Bible, with its pretty stories about rainbows, are nice to chat about on Sundays, but when the dirty work of living needs to be done, well, it seems that all bets are off. Justice is often depicted as a balancing of scales. It is a method for weighing what is owed, what damage has been done. But we're frequently dealing with things that are hard to compare. For can the loss of a life ever truly be compared to any amount of compensation? Furthermore, the desire to fix a problem is different from the deep-seated impulse to punish a wrongdoer. One is about restoring, and the other is about seeking retribution. But we're civilized, aren't we? I suppose that depends upon which civilization we're currently inhabiting. Language is often sloshed around to make it sound like we're enlightened, when in practice we barely reach that eye for an eye standard. What do I mean? A perpetrator in our society is expected to pay his or her debt to that society. And that sounds like a balancing of scales. But that debt usually takes the form of spending a certain period of time in prison. How does that restore the balance? How does that fix anything? And the same can be said about the goal of rehabilitation. For why else would we have buildings called houses of correction? And yet much of the criminal justice system seems to be geared towards punishment and deterrence. Don't do that or else. Well, you did that, so it's time to pay. One of the problems with this idea of deterrence is that it makes an unwarranted assumption that people make rational decisions. If any of you have ever studied economics, you may have noted a similar problem. People are described as making rational economic choices in textbooks, but they don't seem to do that in the real world. They make rash purchases. They gamble away their hard-earned money. Well, with that in mind, who makes a rational decision to get into a bar fight, to act out of road rage, to commit domestic violence? Deterrence assumes a thoughtful response. Is it any wonder the U.S. prison population has quadrupled since the 1970s? I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have prisons, but it might be a good idea to plan for the day when those many, many prisoners get out into a society that will not employ them or rent them apartments. If you give someone no choice, don't be surprised what they choose. If you are the person harmed or someone you love, I can imagine why justice takes the shape of vengeance. But as a society, it makes more sense for justice to look like fixing the problem. Do you put drug users in jail or do you send them off to treatment? Do you send teenagers to jail or do you help them learn that there are better ways to express anger? Do you fix the problems of rage or ignorance, or do you just park it all in a warehouse so that it can ferment and simmer for 3 to 5 years? Sometimes turning the other cheek means figuring out a way so that in the future no one else gets slapped in the face. It is a challenge that is not easily met by just building another prison. It's a challenge that requires letting go of punishment as the only objective, and instead correcting what has gone wrong as the primary goal, even alongside some form of punishment. That is a challenge worthy of those who choose to follow Jesus. For did he not say, "Judge not, lest ye be judged"? So even as we must judge in some way in this life, so too we will be judged by how we respond. Recall the significance of Noah at the time of the Great Flood. He was a moral man in the midst of an immoral society. Into which category would we sort ourselves, our society? A little from column A, a little from column B. And yet, the expectations of the Bible are to be moral regardless of the expectations of the surrounding society. Everyone does it. Why shouldn't I? That wasn't a good argument when we were teenagers. It did not suddenly get better when the bad examples happened to be adults. To be moral in the biblical sense is to follow the expectations of God, such as the covenant with Noah not to commit violence. Those expectations are individual, but they also require a broader responsibility for the sources of violence. We are entering into what might be a very difficult time in our current society. Even after we are free to go about our daily lives, the fallout from the quarantine and its effects on our society will be felt for years to come. And with that in mind, it's important to remind ourselves about what God expects of us, what Jesus taught so long ago. To turn the other cheek is not to ignore violence, but to prevent it from spreading, much like our social distancing efforts now. But unlike a virus, anger requires our participation. We have to join in. It needs us to pass it along. Even if the world around us becomes angrier and everything becomes more polarized, it is the responsibility of those who seek to follow Jesus to choose that very different way. In the story of Noah, the moral person was expected to stand firmly against even an immoral society. In the story of Jesus, the moral person turns the other cheek, which means in our current time to help stop the spread of violence, to reduce the tensions, to help resolve conflicts. Again, that doesn't mean heal the world by yourselves, but to strive to be sources of healing and help and hope. That is what we need to try to do. And that is indeed a lot. May we each do our part, and may we leave a slightly more peaceful world for those that come after us. So ends the sermon. Sermon. We will close our time together in prayer. Let us pray for the mothers, ours and all, for the grandmothers, the nanas, the aunties, for the women in our lives by birth and by choice, for those pillars of strength, for those bundles of nerves, for those words of wisdom, for being the cautionary tale, for waiting and worrying, for laughing, for crying, for the chicken soup, for the 3-alarm chili, and other forms of homemade love, for occasionally mistaking the salt for the sugar, for finally noticing that burning smell that's coming out of the kitchen, for trying their best when it was the best that they could do, for being there to dry our tears even if they caused some of them, for working hard and expecting the same from us, for reminding us to be good and for showing us it was sometimes okay to be naughty, for not being perfect, for being ever so human, for all the times you were there with us, even if it was not every time, for being here with us now, for having been with us so long ago. For all of this, for all of you, we give thanks to God. Amen. Our service is now ended. May our service to God and to each other never truly end. Go in peace. God bless. Be well. And goodbye.